Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. Can you believe this is the last day of June? That just blows my mind. The 4th of July weekend is this weekend, and although the time is going fast, it is time well spent and a great time in the life of our church. So I'm so glad to be able to connect with you this way tonight. Tonight's Bible study is from the 5th chapter of 2 Samuel. This is where David becomes king. And it really is the story in between Saul and the events that led David to be king. And I have never taught this before. I thought this was so interesting. It reads this way. It says, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'Look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time, while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, It is you who shall be shepherd of my people of Israel, you who shall be ruler over Israel.' So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. So, this next part is where David makes Jerusalem the capital of the two kingdoms that have now been united. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, 'You will not come in here, even the blind and the lame will turn you back,' thinking, 'David cannot come in here.' Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David had said on that day, 'Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates.'" It's kind of an odd passage. It actually probably means that the way they took the city was through a passage that where their spring had in between where there's so in other words they snuck their way into the city and attacked them and surprised them and was able to open the gates from the inside. So David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city around from the Milo and inward, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Well, this is really an interesting story. It requires some background information, but this really is the story in between. We know what happened with Saul. Saul was a terrible king, ended up falling on his own sword and committing suicide before he was killed in battle. Uh, and then his sons were not good people. They tried to, kind of reign from afar for a little while. And eventually, David becomes king. But there's so much more to the story. And really, what is interesting is that we can look back on this, and what we see is not the beginning of the story, but it is the part of the story in between, because we know that David became the hero of the Hebrew people, and that his best days were ahead of him. Well, the author begins by saying, "Are you goal oriented?" I would answer that question kind of a broad way. Yes, I am goal oriented, and my goal was certainly to have a happy marriage and a happy family. And when Kim and I moved here, we knew this was going to be a great place to raise the girls, and it absolutely has been. I can't tell you how many things have fallen in place over the last 10 years to make my job fulfilling, to make my family happy. We always have goals that we want to travel. We're counting the days till we go out to Montana this year. So the author says, after reaching a goal, it's better to set new objectives than to rest on your laurels. Otherwise, things have a tendency to go downhill. And he says the story in 2 Samuel chapter 5 brings us to the moment when David attained the goal he'd been living into for some time. Remember, Samuel had promised years before that David would become the king over Israel. And so today's text marks the crowning moment. Fortunately, David recognized he hadn't reached the end of the road. There was still so much work to do. So there were, many battles to be fought in many ways. So he breaks this down talking about David, king of Judah. Remember, David was known for uniting the kingdom. So this is in part what happens in this story. And then David, king of all Israel, and then David, king in Jerusalem. Remember, there was, at that time, Jerusalem was not even occupied by the Hebrew people. It had to be conquered by David. So he says we can't appreciate the significance of this passage without a brief review of what had happened since Saul's death. He says David had really been busy. His first move was to seek God's guidance, and God responded affirmatively and pointed to Hebron. And so David left where he was, and he moved his wives and his private army to this area. And then all the elders of Judah came and anointed him to be king over Judah. So the author says, note that this reflects a time of two kingdoms. David ruled the large southern tribe of Judah, while Saul's son, Ishbaal, was officially king over the rest of Israel. He says David understood the importance of public relations, so he began reaching out to the former king's supporters in the north. And when he heard that the city of Jabesh Gilead had risked their lives to recover the bodies of Saul and his sons from public display, he sent a message of congratulations and promised loyalty to them. So he's reaching out and building bridges. He says David personally stayed in the background during a period of civil war between the northern and the southern kingdoms. So David is hedging his bets here, and he's watching carefully, and he's waiting for the right moment. And he says the writer notes that David took additional wives and sired sons by 6 of them. This is his way of emphasizing that the house of David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And then something horrible happened that David was able to take advantage of. He says 2 Benjamite renegades assassinated Ishbaal, the king, and brought his head to David, thinking to receive a reward. And intent on sending a strong signal he did not approve of the murder, David ordered his guards to kill these 2 men and cut off their hands and feet and hang their bodies beside the pool at Hebron. So David buried Ishbaal's head with due honor, demonstrating that he was not complicit in his death. And this was also the way of him gaining their supporters. So then it's David, king of all Israel. He says this sets the stage for what we read today. All the tribes of Israel sent representatives to David in Hebron, offering to bring the northern tribes into his kingdom. So leading the army was the purpose of which the elders had originally sought a king, but then it shifts to a more spiritual appeal. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be the shepherd of my people, and you shall be ruler over Israel. You know, obviously the military aspect was really important because they knew that their lives were on the line. But remember, this was always a problem all the way until the time Jesus came around, because the people wanted a military leader. They wanted a military Messiah. They wanted to get back to the glory days of David. Those were the glory years. And Jesus was not about that. Jesus was all about the future. But he says the elders of Israel came to David, who made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, which probably means that a priest was involved, would have been given the prayers, and you know, a sacrifice would have been offered, and the act certainly would have been considered a sacred event. But he says, although David is center stage, his activity in the story is really very little. It says the narrator carefully constructed the account to establish that, I thought this was such a good point, David was not driven by ego or for a hunger of power, but had been chosen by God and invited to serve by Israel's elders. I'm actually talking about my own call in my sermon this Sunday, that, you know, I was given an invitation into ministry. I did not have to take it. I wasn't forced into it, but God gave me an invitation, and I said yes. He says the end result was the same. David had become the popular and powerful ruler of all the tribes, the first king of a truly united Israel, destined to rule for 40 years. So finally, the dream of the Hebrew people being united in one kingdom was made possible by David. And then he ends with talking about David, king in Jerusalem. He says, as king over all the tribes, David had decisions to make to do. He knew that Hebron was too far south to serve as a good capital for the entire nation, but if he moved to a city in the north, it might alienate his southern supporters. So David found the solution in the city of Jerusalem, but he had to go take it. So he says, recognizing its strategic value, David led his private army to conquer Jerusalem and declared the city to be the personal property of the king, an autonomous seat of government not beholden or belonging to either Israel or Judah. So this was him really taking charge and finding his place. It says, having captured Jerusalem with his personal army, the new king named it the City of David, indicating its independence from tribal loyalty. So, obviously he's consolidating his power. Since we're unlikely to become a king or queen, does this text have anything to say to our situation? And this guy always does such a great job. He says, a careful look reveals helpful lessons as we see a story that began in conflict move toward resolution and peaceful cooperation when people make wise decisions. He says all of us have seen or been involved in disagreements that led to really bad feelings in a church, in a community, or a country. To move forward in any of these settings, you have to get past suspicious polarization to remember that we live in a relationship. Remember, it said we are bone and flesh, even if not related by blood. He says the opportunity for cooperation is especially apparent in times of leadership transition. A lot of churches have problems in between pastors a lot of times. I've seen this happen many times. He says, we may or may not believe our new leaders have been chosen by God, but we can do our best to work together for the good of all. And then he ends by saying, whether in the church, the family, the workplace, or the country, choosing to cooperate and support each other is key to a promising future. This actually speaks very much to where we find ourselves in a church, as a church family, because it is this idea that it's the story in between. We're in this in between time now. None of us would have ever predicted that this pandemic would come along and cause us to have to go completely online for so long. And now we're back and we're plotting out what the next year is going to look like. We've got goals. We've got some surprising things that we're going to be announcing soon about some of the things that we're going to do. And it's really just a wonderful time in the life of our church. Our church this past week voted unanimously to hire a consultant to come in and help us with our online presence, our sound and our video. And for years, people have been asking me to put my sermons online, and I would always say the same thing. No, I want you to come to my church. I want you to experience how wonderful and happy our people are, how welcoming they are. I want you to hear the full sound of the music, and it's just not translated online. Well, now things change. We have to pivot. We had to do that. And everybody was so in agreement to make those things happen and to spend the money in order to do it. And what that tells us is that our best days are out ahead of us. How great is it? It just doesn't happen very often in churches that are as old as ours. There's something about that 50-year mark. We are at our 60-year mark. But if you'll notice, most churches that are older than 50 years old have been in decline for the last 20 years. And that is not the case with our church. We are so blessed in so many ways, and we have every reason to believe that our best days are out ahead of us. So glad to connect with you tonight. I hope this message finds you well, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Go in peace.